December 11, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Snow falls in thick, silent curtains across the ancient pines of Belgium, each flake settling upon a landscape that has known war since the time of Julius Caesar. The temperature hovers just below freezing, and the air carries that peculiar metallic taste that comes before a storm, or before steel meets steel. In a narrow forest road carved between towering evergreens, the earth trembles. It is not an earthquake. It is the approach of 50 tons of German engineering, the Panther G, its interleaved road wheels crushing frozen mud into powder, its long 75 mm gun sweeping the tree line like the head of some primordial predator. Inside the hull, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter presses his face against the periscope, his breath fogging the glass despite the bitter cold that seeps through every rivet and weld. He can see perhaps 30 meters ahead through the snowfall, no more. The radio crackles with static and fragmentary reports. American infantry spotted. Grid coordinates follow. The Panther's engine roars, a Maybach HL 230 delivering 700 horsepower, and the massive tank surges forward. Richter has served in the Panzerwaffe since the triumphant summer of 1940, when these machines were invincible guards rolling across France. He believes, even now in this winter of Germany's desperation, that nothing the Americans possess can truly threaten him. The Panther's frontal armor is 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees, the equivalent of 140 millimeters of vertical steel. He has seen American 37 mm guns bounce shells off this armor like pebbles off a cathedral wall. What he does not know, what he cannot know as his tank rounds the bend in that forest road, is that crouched behind a snow-covered fallen oak, barely 60 meters distant, Private First Class Robert Hendricks of the 101st Airborne Division is gripping a weapon that will rewrite the contract between man and machine. It is called the M1A1 Bazooka, and in the moment Hendricks shoulders it, pressing his cheek against the cold metal tube, a new chapter in armored warfare is about to be written in fire. The story of how American soldiers came to carry a weapon that could burn through the finest armor Germany could forge begins not in the forests of Belgium, but in the desperate laboratories and proving grounds of a nation that had been, until very recently, utterly unprepared for modern war. In 1940, when the Wehrmacht's panzers had swept through Poland and France with a speed that shocked the world, the United States Army possessed exactly 0 effective infantry anti-tank weapons. The standard anti-tank rifle, the Boys, 55 caliber rifle borrowed from the British, could barely scratch the paint of a German Panzer Roman III, let alone penetrate its armor. American military doctrine, still mired in the trench warfare mentality of the First World War, had failed to grasp the essential reality of mechanized combat, that armor had evolved faster than the weapons designed to defeat it. The War Department's Ordnance Division understood this gap with growing alarm. Reports from Europe painted a grim picture. In France, British and French infantry had been helpless against German armor. Men had thrown Molotov cocktails, explosive charges, even their own bodies at tanks, and died in their thousands while the panzers rolled on. If America were to enter this war, and by 1941 it seemed increasingly inevitable, her soldiers would face the same steel monsters, and they would need something better than desperation and gasoline bottles. The solution came from an unlikely source. Lieutenant Edward Uhl, a young engineer at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, had been experimenting with rocket propulsion systems since 1940. Rockets were not new. The Chinese had invented them centuries ago, and various armies had experimented with rocket artillery throughout history. But rockets were notoriously inaccurate, their thrust unpredictable, their trajectory erratic. Uhl's innovation was not the rocket itself, but the delivery system. In May of 1942, he took a simple steel tube, approximately 54 inches long and 36 inches in diameter, attached a basic electrical firing mechanism, and mounted a rudimentary sight on top. The rocket itself was equally straightforward, a shape-charge warhead developed by Swiss physicist Henry Mohaupt, which used the Monroe effect, a phenomenon discovered in the 1880s to focus explosive force into a superheated jet of metal capable of penetrating armor. The shape charge was revolutionary in its simplicity. When the explosive detonated, a copper liner inside the warhead collapsed inward, forming a jet of molten metal traveling at speeds exceeding 25 0.000 feet per second. This jet, though it lasted only microseconds, could punch through steel plate like a torch through butter. The principle had been understood for decades, but no one had successfully weaponized it in a man-portable system until WWII fitted it to his tube-launched rocket. The weapon was demonstrated to a skeptical board of generals in June 1942. A soldier, standing in the open, fired the rocket at a moving tank target at 100 yards. The rocket struck the armor and detonated. When the smoke cleared, there was a hole the size of a silver dollar punched clean through quarter-inch steel plate. The generals, accustomed to artillery pieces that required trucks to move and crews of 6 men to operate, were stunned that a single infantryman could achieve such destructive power. The weapon was immediately approved for production. Someone remarked that the tube looked like the musical instrument Bob Burns played on the radio, a crude trombone called a bazooka, and the name stuck. By September 1942, the first M1 Bazookas were rolling off assembly lines. By 1943, improved M1A1 models were being shipped to every theater of war. German tankers, meanwhile, remained supremely confident in their armor, and they had reason to be. The evolution of the German tank force from 1939 to 1944 represented a quantum leap in armored warfare. The early Panzer I and Roman II models that had conquered Poland were little more than training vehicles with light armor and inadequate guns. But by 1941, Germany was producing the Panzer Roman IV with its long-barreled 75 mm gun, and by 1943, the devastating Panther and Tiger tanks began appearing on battlefields across Europe and Russia. The Panther, in particular, was considered by many historians to be the finest medium tank of the war. Weighing 45 tons, armed with a high-velocity KWK-42L/70 gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, and protected by thick, sloped armor that deflected conventional anti-tank rounds, the Panther represented the pinnacle of German engineering. The Tiger I, even heavier at 54 tons, mounted the legendary 88 mm gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, but devastating against armor, and frontal armor 100 mm thick. German tank doctrine emphasized superior firepower and protection. Their tanks were designed to engage enemy armor at long range, using superior optics and gunnery training to destroy opponents before they could close to effective firing distance. Against Soviet T-34s and American M4 Shermans, this doctrine worked devastatingly well. A single Tiger could, and frequently did, destroy a dozen Allied tanks in a single engagement. German crews developed an almost mythological sense of invincibility. They were the knights of the modern battlefield, encased in steel, wielding weapons that could kill at distances measured in kilometers. Infantry were beneath their notice, soft targets that scattered before the thunder of approaching tracks. But the American infantrymen who crouched in foxholes and forest clearings with a bazooka represented something German tactical thinking had not fully accounted for: the democratization of anti-tank capability. For centuries, warfare had been dominated by specialized weapon systems, cavalry, artillery, armored knights, that required years of training and enormous resources. Tanks were the latest iteration of this paradigm. A Panzer cost hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks, required a crew of 5 highly trained men, consumed fuel at prodigious rates, and demanded constant mechanical maintenance. The bazooka cost approximately $20 to manufacture. It could be operated by a 2-man team, a gunner and a loader with minimal training. A farm boy from Iowa who had never seen a tank before basic training could, after a few hours of instruction, become capable of destroying a Tiger. This was military egalitarianism, of a sort that contradicted every principle of the Wehrmacht's hierarchical philosophy. The German army was an organization built on specialization and technical excellence. The Panzerwaffe was an elite force, its crews carefully selected and extensively trained. The idea that a common foot soldier, huddling in a ditch, could threaten a Panther was almost offensive to German military sensibilities. Yet that is precisely what began happening with increasing frequency as American forces pushed into Europe in 1944. The first major encounter between bazookas and German heavy armor occurred during Operation Torch in North Africa in November 1942, but the terrain there, open desert with long sight lines, favored the German tank's superior range and gunnery. The bazooka teams found few opportunities to close within their effective range of 100 to 150 yards. It was in Italy, in the close terrain of mountain passes and medieval villages, that the bazooka began to prove its worth. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, inexperienced American troops were savaged by German panzers, but isolated incidents were reported of disabled German tanks with peculiar burn marks on their armor. German maintenance crews were puzzled by these damage patterns, circular scorch marks surrounding holes that appeared to have been melted rather than punctured by kinetic impact. The shape and size of the penetrations did not match any known anti-tank gun. Intelligence reports began circulating through Wehrmacht command about a new American weapon, some form of rocket launcher, though details were scarce. The German response was characteristically technical and thorough. Engineers analyzed captured bazookas and immediately understood the threat. The shaped charge warhead did not rely on kinetic energy. It did not matter how thick the armor was in absolute terms, if the explosive jet could sustain its penetrating power through sufficient depth. The solution was to add standoff armor, additional plates mounted several inches in front of the main armor, designed to trigger the shaped charge prematurely before it could be effective. Zimmerit paste, a rough coating applied to German armor starting in late 1943, was partly intended to prevent magnetic mines, but also disrupted shaped charge jets. Schuezen, thin steel skirts hung on the sides of tanks, were specifically designed to defend against bazooka rounds, but these countermeasures added weight, reduced mobility, and could not protect every surface. A tank has vulnerable points: thinner side and rear armor, engine grills, turret rings, track assemblies. The bazooka gave American infantry the ability to exploit these weaknesses in ways that had not been possible before. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy and began the grinding campaign through the hedgerows of France, the bazooka had become standard equipment for American infantry units. Each rifle company typically had several two-man bazooka teams, and their doctrine was refined through bitter experience. The key was patience and positioning. A bazooka gunner could not engage a tank from the front at long range. That was suicide. Instead, bazooka teams learned to let the tanks come to them, to hide in rubble or vegetation, to wait until the massive steel beasts were close enough that a miss was nearly impossible, and then to aim for the vulnerable spots. The side armor of a Panzer Roman IV was only 30 millimeters thick. The rear armor of even a Tiger was 80 millimeters thick by infantry weapon standards, but well within the bazooka's penetration capability at close range. The psychological impact on German tank crews was profound and unexpected. Tankers had grown accustomed to fighting other tanks, a duel of steel against steel, gun against gun, where superior equipment and training usually determined the victor. They understood that danger, but the bazooka introduced a new kind of threat: the invisible enemy, the patient hunter who could be anywhere. A tank commander could scan the landscape with his periscope, see no anti-tank guns, no enemy armor, and believe himself safe. Then, from a farmhouse window or a roadside ditch barely 20 meters away, a rocket would scream out of concealment, and in the fraction of a second before impact, there was nothing the crew could do. No evasive maneuver, no suppressing fire, just the sudden, terrible knowledge that death was already in flight toward them. The physics of what happened in that moment of impact were both elegant and horrific. The bazooka rocket, once fired, traveled at approximately 265 feet per second, slow by artillery standards, but across a distance of 50 or 100 yards, the flight time was less than a second. Upon striking the tank's armor, the piezoelectric fuse in the nose would detect the impact and generate an electrical current, which would detonate the explosive charge in the warhead. The shaped charge liner, a cone of copper approximately 3 inches in diameter, would collapse inward under the pressure of the explosion. The laws of physics governing this process were complex, involving hydrodynamic flow, shock wave propagation, and extreme temperatures, but the result was straightforward. A jet of molten copper and explosive gases, moving at hypersonic velocity and focused to a diameter of less than an inch, would strike the tank's armor. The armor, whether it was rolled homogeneous steel or face-hardened plate, would offer resistance for a few microseconds. Then the jet would begin to penetrate. It did not drill through the armor in the conventional sense. Rather, it eroded it, the superheated metal flowing through the steel like water through sand, pushing the armor material aside and creating a channel. The penetration depth depended on many factors: the standoff distance between the warhead and the armor, the angle of impact, the quality of the explosive and the liner. But under optimal conditions, the M1A1 shaped charge warhead used in the bazooka could penetrate up to 5 inches of armor plate. Once the jet punched through the armor, it entered the tank's interior as a spray of molten metal and superheated gas, still carrying tremendous kinetic energy. This was the moment when the tank transformed from fortress to tomb. Inside the confined space of a tank's fighting compartment, the effects were catastrophic. The jet would strike whatever was in its path: ammunition, fuel, equipment, human bodies. The temperature of the molten copper exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. Flesh would vaporize instantly. Steel would melt. Ammunition would cook off, and the tank would erupt in a secondary explosion that would blow the turret off its ring or split the hull like an overripe fruit. Even if the jet did not directly strike ammunition, the overpressure and heat inside the sealed compartment were often sufficient to ignite propellant charges or diesel fuel. And even if fire did not follow, the concussive force and metal spool, fragments of the armor's inner face, broken loose and sent ricocheting through the interior at lethal velocity, could kill or maim the crew. German tankers developed a dark vocabulary for these weapons. They called the bazooka the Panzerschreck, tank terror, though technically that was the name of the German copy of the weapon. The American version they simply called the tube or the pipe. What they feared most was not the weapon itself, but the tactical situation it created. In open terrain, a tank could maneuver, use its speed and the range of its main gun to engage threats before they closed. But in the close terrain of European forests, villages and cities, the advantage shifted dramatically toward the defender. A bazooka team dug into rubble or hidden in a cellar could wait in silence for hours, then emerge, fire, and disappear in seconds. The tank crew might never see their attackers. They would simply be advancing down a street, and then there would be a flash, a bang, and the screaming would begin. The winter of 1944 brought these fears to a crescendo during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive in the West. Hitler had gambled everything on a desperate thrust through the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The attack began on December 16th with a massive artillery barrage through fog and snow, followed by the rumble of hundreds of panzers, Panthers, Tigers, and the colossal King Tigers with their 70-ton bulk and nearly impenetrable frontal armor. Against this steel tide stood scattered American units. Many of them inexperienced replacements rushed to what had been considered a quiet sector. But they had bazookas, and they had learned how to use them. In the village of Lanzerath, a single reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Infantry Division, heavily outnumbered, held off an entire German battle group for nearly a day. The dense forests and narrow roads of the Ardennes negated the German armor's advantage in range and speed. Panthers and King Tigers found themselves confined to a handful of roads, unable to deploy off-road in the heavy snow and dense vegetation. American infantry, falling back before the German advance, would set up hasty ambushes at every crossroads and bridge. A disabled tank on a narrow forest road could block the advance of an entire column for hours. The Germans had planned for resistance from American armor. They knew their Tigers could defeat Shermans. What they had not planned for was the sheer number of infantry-portable anti-tank weapons the Americans deployed. Every squad seemed to have a bazooka. Every foxhole was a potential ambush. German commanders found their timetables slipping as lead tanks were disabled, as engineers worked under fire to clear wrecks from roads, as surviving crews became increasingly reluctant to advance without extensive infantry support. At the siege of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and outnumbered, held the vital road junction against repeated German armored assaults. The paratroopers had been rushed to Bastogne with minimal heavy equipment. No tanks, few anti-tank guns, limited artillery. What they had in abundance were bazookas and the tactical skill to use them. The town's perimeter ran through farmland and small villages, broken terrain that forced German tanks to approach along predictable routes. The paratroopers, many of them veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, had perfected the art of the tank ambush. They would allow German armor to penetrate into the town, then attack from multiple directions simultaneously, targeting the vulnerable side and rear armor. A Panther, formidable in open combat, became a liability in the narrow streets of Bastogne, its long gun barrel scraping buildings, its limited turret traverse preventing it from engaging multiple threats. American after-action reports from Bastogne describe scenes that must have seemed surreal to the German crews involved. A Panther would round a corner, and 3 or 4 bazooka teams would fire simultaneously from different buildings. The tank, struck from multiple angles, would shudder to a halt, smoke pouring from hatches. The crew, if they survived, would bail out and surrender or flee. But often there were no survivors. The Americans would retrieve the bazookas and prepare the next ambush. Over the course of the siege, the 101st destroyed dozens of German tanks with bazookas and captured shape charge munitions, inflicting losses that the Wehrmacht, by December 1944, could no longer afford to replace. The personal accounts from German tankers who survived these encounters reveal a profound psychological shift. In the early war years, memoirs and letters from panzer crews are filled with confidence, even arrogance. They describe the thrill of maneuver warfare, the satisfaction of destroying enemy tanks from long range, the sense of invulnerability that came from serving in the finest armored vehicles in the world. But by late 1944, the tone changes dramatically. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Mertens, a Panther commander in the 116th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary during the Bulge offensive, "We advance through the forest like blind men. The Americans are everywhere and nowhere. We cannot see them, cannot predict where they hide. Yesterday we lost 3 tanks in an hour, not to their Shermans which we can handle, but to the damned tubes their infantry carry." Schneider's Panther took a rocket through the side armor. The explosion blew the turret crew apart. By the time we got him out, he was burnt beyond recognition. We are supposed to be the hunters, but I feel like prey. This sense of vulnerability, of being hunted rather than hunting, was a novel and deeply disturbing experience for German armored forces. The entire ethos of the Panzerwaffe was built on technical superiority and aggressive offensive action. German crews were trained to identify enemy tanks at extreme ranges, to achieve first-round hits, to maneuver for advantageous positions. These skills were useless against an enemy who did not engage in tank versus tank combat, who waited until the German tanks were so close that maneuver was impossible, and the first shot was invariably fatal. The American soldiers who carried bazookas, meanwhile, were experiencing their own transformation. Many were young men, barely out of their teens, who had grown up during the Depression in rural towns and small cities across America. They had enlisted or been drafted into a war whose scale and brutality exceeded anything in their experience or imagination. The training they received was intensive, but could not fully prepare them for the reality of combat. The first time a soldier faced a German tank, the ground shaking under its weight, the roar of its engine, the malevolent shape of its gun swinging toward him, was a moment of pure existential terror. The tank was everything he was not: powerful, armored, impersonal, a machine designed solely to kill. The natural instinct was to run, to hide, to do anything except stand and face that oncoming doom. But the bazooka gave these young men a tool that could equalize the contest. Private James Simmons of the 82nd Airborne described his first tank kill in a letter home, written weeks after the event when his hands had finally stopped shaking enough to hold a pen. "There's something about seeing a tank through the sight of a bazooka that changes how you think. It's not a monster anymore. It's a target. You focus on the aiming point, the side armor, the track assembly, the spot you've been trained to hit. You stop thinking about the fact that there are men inside, that the thing weighs as much as 30 cars, that its gun could vaporize you. You just think, steady hands, correct distance, lead the target if it's moving, squeeze the trigger. And when the rocket fires and you see it hit, when the tank shudders and stops, there's this moment of pure disbelief. I did that. Me with this pipe on my shoulder, I killed a tank. It's terrifying and thrilling all at once, and afterward you're shaking so hard you can barely stand, but you've learned something important. You've learned that even the biggest, scariest thing the enemy has can be beaten. That changes you. This democratization of anti-tank capability had implications that extended far beyond the tactical level. The bazooka was, in a very real sense, an expression of American industrial and philosophical principles applied to warfare. Consider the contrast. German war production, even at its peak, could manufacture approximately 6,000 tanks per year. Each tank represented thousands of man-hours of labor, scarce raw materials, and complex manufacturing processes. Germany's industrial capacity was limited, and by 1944, strategic bombing and shortages of critical materials like tungsten and molybdenum were constraining production further. The loss of each tank was a significant blow. The United States, by contrast, produced over 88,000 tanks during the war, but more importantly, produced over 450,000 bazookas. The cost differential was staggering. For the resources required to build and field one Panther tank, America could equip hundreds of infantry with bazookas. This was mass production applied to lethality, and it reflected a fundamentally different approach to warfare. The German military tradition emphasized quality over quantity, relying on superior technology and training to offset numerical disadvantages. The American approach, rooted in the industrial principles that had transformed the nation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, emphasized standardization, mass production, and the widest possible distribution of capable weapons. The bazooka was not a precision instrument. Its accuracy was mediocre, its range limited, its reliability sometimes questionable. But it was good enough, and there were enough of them, that American infantry could afford to use them liberally. A German tank commander might face not one or two anti-tank guns, specialized, expensive weapons carefully positioned, but a dozen or more bazooka teams, any one of which could kill his tank if he made a mistake. The psychological impact of this abundance cannot be overstated. German soldiers, by late 1944, were fighting in a material environment that was utterly alien to their experience. They came from a nation that had been rationed and resource-constrained since before the war began. Every round of ammunition, every liter of fuel, every replacement part for a vehicle was precious and scarce. They were trained to conserve, to make every shot count, to maintain equipment obsessively because replacements might not come. And then they encountered American forces, who seemed to have limitless supplies of everything. The Americans fired artillery barrages that expended more shells in an hour than a German division might receive in a month. They called in airstrikes as casually as ordering breakfast. They discarded equipment that was damaged or worn rather than repairing it. And they carried bazookas in such numbers that German tankers reported encountering bazooka fire from multiple directions almost every time they engaged American infantry. Lieutenant Friedrich Sander, captured after his Panzer Roman IV was disabled outside Bastogne, expressed this disbelief in his interrogation. "Where do all these rockets come from? Every American soldier seems to have one. We destroy one team and two more appear. We cannot fight an army that has infinite weapons." The interrogator, an American intelligence officer, noted in his report that Sander's perception of infinite weapons was psychologically significant. The Germans were not merely being outfought, they were being overwhelmed by an abundance they could not comprehend or counter. This was economic warfare waged at the tactical level, and it was devastating to German morale. Yet the bazooka was not without its limitations and dangers. The early M1 model had significant flaws. The electrical firing mechanism was prone to failure in wet conditions, and the weapon produced a massive backblast, a jet of fire and gas expelled from the rear of the tube that could extend 15 feet behind the gunner. This backblast revealed the shooter's position instantly and could injure friendly troops or set vegetation on fire. Bazooka teams learned to check their backblast area obsessively before firing and to displace immediately after shooting, because German infantry would invariably target the source of the rocket. The rocket itself was sometimes unreliable. Dud rates could reach 10% or higher in some batches of ammunition. A bazooka team that fired at a tank and scored a hit, only to have the warhead fail to detonate, faced almost certain death. The tank crew, alerted to the threat, would swivel their machine guns or main gun toward the source of the attack and obliterate it. And firing a bazooka required a degree of courage that bordered on the suicidal. To be effective, the gunner had to wait until the tank was close, often terrifyingly close, 50 yards or less. He had to rise from cover, shoulder the weapon, aim and fire, while the tank's machine guns were potentially already shooting at him. The loader, crouched beside him, had to remain exposed long enough to insert the rocket into the rear of the tube and arm it. In those few seconds, the two-man team was completely vulnerable. Many bazooka gunners were killed before they could fire. Many more were killed immediately after firing, cut down by return fire before they could retreat to cover. But those who mastered the weapon developed an almost mystical confidence in its power. Staff Sergeant William Guarner of the 101st Airborne, later known as Wild Bill, described the mentality of an experienced bazooka gunner. You get to know your weapon. You get to know exactly how far that rocket will go before it starts to drop, how much to lead a moving target, what angle you need to hit the armor, and you get to know fear, real fear, the kind that makes your stomach turn to water. But you also get to know that you can kill a tank. That knowledge is power. I've seen guys freeze up in combat, seen tough men curl up in a foxhole and refuse to move because the fear is just too much. But give a man a bazooka and train him right, and you've given him something the Germans don't have. You've given him the ability to fight back against the thing that scares him most. That changes a man. It makes him dangerous. This transformation, from a frightened infantryman helpless before enemy armor to a hunter capable of destroying it, was replicated thousands of times across the European theater. It created a cadre of soldiers who no longer saw German tanks as invincible, and who, through repeated success, developed tactics and techniques that were shared throughout the army. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany, the tactical dynamic had shifted fundamentally. German armored forces, what remained of them, were constrained to defensive operations. Fuel shortages meant that tanks could not maneuver freely. Losses in both equipment and experienced crews had been catastrophic, and the pervasive presence of bazookas among American infantry meant that every German armored counterattack, every attempt to establish a defensive line anchored on tanks, was met with swarms of infantry-portable anti-tank weapons. In the ruined cities of Germany, Aachen, Cologne, Berlin, the close terrain made tanks desperately vulnerable. A Panther navigating a rubble-choked street, with buildings on either side and no infantry support, was simply waiting to die. American infantry would move through buildings, using bazookas to fire from upper-story windows down onto the thinner top armor of tanks, or from alleyways at point-blank range against side armor. The Germans attempted to adapt, refusing to commit armor without extensive infantry screening, but by this stage of the war, they lacked the manpower to provide adequate protection. The Battle of Berlin, that final apocalyptic engagement, saw German tanks, including the monstrous Jagdtiger tank destroyers with their 128 mm guns and 250 mm of frontal armor, destroyed in alleys and squares by Soviet infantry armed with Panzerfausts and RPG-6 grenades, weapons conceptually similar to the bazooka. The age of the tank as an invulnerable breakthrough weapon was over, not because tanks themselves had become obsolete, but because infantry had been equipped with weapons that restored tactical balance. The symbolic weight of this shift extended beyond military tactics into the realm of ideology. The Second World War was, at its core, a conflict between different visions of how human societies should be organized. Nazi Germany represented a philosophy of hierarchy, racial supremacy, and technological determinism. The Wehrmacht's emphasis on elite armored formations reflected this worldview. Power was to be concentrated in the hands of a select few, the best men, using the best equipment, dominating lesser peoples through superior force. The tank was the perfect symbol of this philosophy. Expensive, powerful, requiring years of training to operate effectively, and capable of crushing infantry beneath its treads. The American bazooka, by contrast, represented a different set of values. It was cheap, simple, and designed to be used by ordinary citizens-turned-soldiers with minimal training. It democratized anti-tank capability, distributing lethal power widely rather than concentrating it. Any infantry squad could kill a tank. This was egalitarianism applied to warfare, and it reflected the broader American philosophy that victory came not from cultivating an elite, but from mobilizing the masses. The industrial capacity that produced nearly 500,000 bazookas was the same capacity that had transformed America from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse in 2 generations. It was the capacity of mass production, standardization, and the assembly line, principles developed by Henry Ford and others that had made automobiles, radios, and consumer goods available to ordinary Americans on a scale unimaginable in Europe.